It's Berry Boy. Welcome to another Stream Elements Chatbox video. These first two chatboxes you see here, we've already covered on the channel. We're going to be building this third one here from scratch. And the purpose of this video is to show how you can slide the messages up as new messages come in. As you can see, the first two we built, they kind of just teleport into place because the browser is going to recalculate their position on their own. But with this third one, we're physically translating the Y position. And so the whole purpose of this video is to demonstrate how to get this effect. So we're going to be building this one from scratch. And all of these are available on my Gumroad page. The link will be in the description. So let's get started. All right, so the first thing is we need to get the messages with an event listener. And that's the one thing that's always going to remain consistent with these chat boxes. As if you've worked with JavaScript, you know that there's always like an infinite number of ways to do things. So we'll just start off by adding the event listener. And it's going to be an on event received. So that's the type. And make sure to actually spell that correctly. And we have our callback function, and we need to pass it the actual event object. And there's our event listener. So we're just going to start off by storing the listener. And that way we can check what type of event is happening and act accordingly. The only two event types that we're actually going to be checking though are for the tests, because we will have a test button to test the widget. So if the listener is equal to event test, then we're going to call our function in here, but we haven't set that up yet. So for now, we'll just return. And then we also need to check for messages. So if the listener is equal to message, and we do need to get the message event data, I'm just going to call it message, and I'm going to get the entire data. So when an event message occurs, we're just going to call our main function, which we haven't set up yet, and we're going to pass it the name emotes and the text content. So let's set up our main function. We're going to call it addRow, and we're going to make it async. And for the parameters, we're going to pass it the text, the emotes, and the name. And now we can actually call our addRow function and pass it the correct parameters. Before I move on with the addRow function, I'm just going to finish setting up the test stuff. So on my website, roberry.dev/blog/sc-test-functions, I have all the functions for creating a test. And I have different ones for like followers as well as the message events. So we can just grab that from here because there's no reason to type all that out. Just know that to create these, you just need to create a new custom event, pass it the type of event, and then all of the details of that event, such as the badges, the emotes, the content of the message, the display name, and so forth. And you need to dispatch that on the window. So I'm just going to paste that in. And now in the listener for the event test, we can just call the simulate message event. And then we do also need to create a field for that button. So I'll create a JSON file here and we'll call it test button. And we need a type, a label, and a value. And the type should have a value of button, and the label is going to be the text of that button, and the value will be for a reference if you want to reference this event. So we'll call it test dash button. So that will add a test button like this that will allow you to trigger the message events, and that will call the addRow function, which will display the message and so forth. So that's everything we need for testing the message events. Now we can continue with the addRow function. We're going to be adding rows to a container. So we need to create the HTML element for that. So in the HTML, let's create a div and let's give it an ID of container. And then in our addRow function, let's create a reference to that container with document.getElement by ID. And the ID is container. Now, in order for us to actually animate the Y position of each row, we need to track the current position of all the rows. Now, since each row actually is an HTML element div, we have access to the data attribute of each element. So we can store its initial Y position as a data attribute. So we'll start off by creating an array from the existing rows. So we'll say const existing rows is equal to array.from, and then pass it container query selector all, and we'll select all the elements with the row class. Now we can loop through each existing row with the for each, and then we can store the initial Y position. So we'll do row.dataset.initial Y is equal to row.getBoundingClient.rect.top. So now we've set initial Y as the current position for each row, and we're getting that using the getBoundingClientRect.top. Now that we have the initial Y position for the existing rows, we can actually create the row every time this function gets called, which would be every time a message event occurs. So to create the new row, we'll just use document.createElement, and we'll create a div element. Then we also want to add row to its class list. And now we'll set the inner HTML of the row. For now, we'll just pass it the name. So do const name HTML is equal to template string. I have a div with a class of name, and we'll give it the name. And we'll set the row's inner HTML to our name HTML. And then we will just append that to the container using container.append. Now that we have the new row appended, we can create the animation for the existing rows to move up. And we're actually going to make use of this initial Y data attribute that we set at the top of the function. So to do that, we'll begin by looping over the existing rows and then getting that initial Y position back from the elements. And we'll use parse a float to convert that string to a number, and we'll give it the initial Y. Now that we have that initial Y for each row, we can just get the new Y position. And we can do that using the getBoundingClientRect.top method. And then our delta Y, or difference, is going to be the initial Y minus the new Y. Now we only want to animate the rows that need to move. And to check that, just check if delta Y is not equal to 0. And we will use the from to method from JSAP to animate this. So we'll say jsap.from2. We'll call this existing row instead of row, so it makes more sense. And we'll pass that to from to function. So we're going to be animating it from its delta Y to Y0, a duration of 1, and an ease of power 3 dot out. Now, the reason why this is set to 0 is because the browser actually is going to be recalculating its position. We're just telling it that we want it to animate from its initial position to its new natural position. So the browser is actually recalculating its position. It's just that we're telling it that we want it to actually animate. And the way that we're doing that is by storing the initial positions of the rows before the new row is added. Then after the new row is added, we're taking the new position with its initial position to, calculate. So the delta Y is the distance it needs to travel to get to its new position in the DOM. Initial Y is its position before any new row is added. new y is the position after a row is added, and delta y is the difference between those two, which is the distance that it needs to travel to get to its natural position, which is 0. And since delta y represents the difference, it'll make the element slide into place whether it needs to move up or down. Since we're telling it we need to move it from the distance it needs to travel to its natural position. So animating from delta y to 0, ensure that the row animates smoothly to its recalculated position in the DOM, creating a natural sliding effect. Now we animated the existing rows, but we also want to animate the new row that's coming in. So animate the new row. So we're going to use JSOP from for this. And this is going to animate it from the values that we set to its natural state in the DOM. So the new row is the row, and we are going to animate a few different properties. We'll do the opacity to 0, the Y, and this will be row.offset height. We'll animate the scale from 0.75 to 1. The duration will be 0 or 1, and the ease will be power3.out. So we're actually almost through this. We just have a couple more things like the emotes, some of the text content. We should add a queue. So if this function is already running, we basically add it to the queue. So otherwise, it could be quite janky if it's trying to run this function at the same time. But before we move on to anything, we probably want to look at the progress and test things out, make sure they're working good. And so we should add some CSS styling before we do anything else. So let's just get that out of the way now. So I'll create a new file. If you're working on Stream Elements, just go to the CSS tab. And each of these files would represent a tab. Like this is the HTML, JavaScript fields. And now we're creating the CSS. I will name that. We're going to be styling the body, an ID of container for our container. And then we have a row class, a name class, message, and last we have a class of emote. So for the body, it's going to be a flex container, and we'll justify the content, center it, align items. We'll do flex end, margin 0, just your standard stuff here, padding 0, height 100 VH, which is the entire viewport or page. Overflow hidden because I don't want any scroll bars. And then you could put a font here if you want. So for the container, it's also going to be a flex container, and give it a flex direction of column. We'll justify the content. We'll use flex end. We'll give it a gap, 12 pixels, a height of 100%, a width of 90%, max width, we'll do 500 pixels, overflow hidden. And we'll give it some padding, 15 pixels around, all the way around. Now for the row, it's also going to be flex. And the direct flex direction is going to be column, even though it's a row. Background, for now, we'll just give it a black background. Also give this some padding, 15 pixels. A border radius to make the corners more rounded. And how about some box shadow? Now for the name class, let's make it bold for the font weight. For the color, for now, let's just do white. Later on, I'll be changing these to custom fields for like the background and the text color. But for now, just hard code the values. And the font size will be 24 pixels. Margin bottom, 5 pixels. Moving on to the message class, also display flex. Everything's flex. Flex wrap, align items center, font size, let's do 16. For color, I'll just do white again, since we have a black background set. And the word wrap, this is for like if the text is very long and it goes outside the message element, it'll just wrap to the next line. And that's why we'll have these next 3 lines for word break. It's going to be break word. This is also going to help with that. The overflow wrap. Also set that to break word. And then the word break. Also set that to break word. And then last we have the emote class. So we'll give that a width of 20 pixels, height of 20 pixels, vertical, align middle, and margin 0, 3 pixels. And that's all of the CSS, so we won't have to touch that again, actually. Not too bad. Now we're going to add the queue. Essentially, if a new message is animating and then a new message comes in while that one's still animating, we'll add it to the queue so that it can process. That way, if messages come in like at nearly the same time, it won't be all janky. So at the top of our JavaScript file, let's create a Boolean flag using the let keyword is animating and set that to false. Then for the queue, we'll just create an array. Now in the addRow function, we just need to check if is animating. And if it is animating, then we'll just push the text emotes and name to the message queue array. And then we can return and then set the is animating flag to true. So essentially, if this function gets called while it's already running, it'll just push the message into the queue and not run any of the code below it. If a message does get added to the queue, we need to process it after the new one is finished. So to do that, we just come down to the animation for the new row at the bottom of the addRow function, and we'll put an onComplete callback function. And inside this function, we'll set our is animating flag back to false. If there is a message in the queue, we will store that in the next message variable and remove it from the array. And then we will go ahead and call this function. So then that gets added as a row. And we'll just say here, recursively call addRow to process the next message. So that's everything for the queue. Very simple queue. And one other thing we should do, we are handling the removing of the messages from the array in the queue, but we do want to still remove the actual DOM elements after they exceed a certain amount. That way we don't clutter up the DOM. So we will create a new global variable called max messages, and I'll just set that to 10. And then all that we have to do is after we append the row, we'll create a while loop. If the container exceeds max messages, then we'll just remove it from the DOM. So remove child container.firstChild. And then the last thing is right now we're only displaying the name because we needed to create the function to handle the emotes with the text. So we will do that now. So below the addRow function, create a new function called handle emotes. And this will be an async function and it will be past the text and the emotes. Now this is the same function I use in all of my Chatbox widgets, except for we've improved on it a bit. Now we're validating the URLs before displaying the emote. That way, if the image is not actually found, it won't just display like one of those things, you know what I'm talking about. So if there's no emotes, then we just want to return the text. So to say no emotes or emotes.length is equal to 0, then return text. Now we want to sort the emotes array by their start index, and that's the start and end index here. That's the position that they lie in the string. So we want the array to have the ones with the lowest starting value first and the highest starting value last. So where did I go? Where's my function? Here it is. Okay, so that's just going to be emotes.sort, and GitHub Copilot already knows what I'm doing here. And then we need an empty string for to handle where we're going to replace the emotes and things in the text in the string. And we'll need an index. So I like to call it last index. Set that to 0. Now here's actually where we're going to validate the URL. So we're going to say const is valid URL. It's going to be async. We're going to pass it a URL, and we're going to use a try catch. Return false if it's an error. And inside of our try, we're just going to try and fetch the image. So const response is equal to await fetch URL. And I'm going to pass it the method of head. And that needs to be inside of an object. And then we're just going to return response okay if there's no error. Now we're going to process each emote and check if the URL is valid. Const emote of emotes, and const URL is equal to emotes.urls 1, because we just need to grab the first index of the array. And then and we're going to await that before we move on to check if the URL is valid. Now we're going to add the text before the emotes to the result string. So plus equals text dot substring and pass it the last index in the emote dot start. And then we'll add the emote image if valid. And that's a template string that's an image tag, and we'll give it the URL and the emote name. And then we need to increment the last index by the emote end plus 1. And last, we need to add the remaining text after the last emote, and then just return the result. And make sure to actually close the isValidURL function. Now, when we add the inner HTML in the addRow function, we also need to add the text with the emotes, not just the name. So go to the addRow function below the name HTML, and we'll create a new variable called message HTML. And then we'll await our handle emotes function and pass it the text in the emotes. And now when we add the inner HTML, we can add a div after the name HTML, give it a class of message, and pass it the message HTML. And that's the entire thing. If you've made it this far, you are an absolute wizard. The final code for this will be on my Gumroad. And if you want to make sure it matches up with yours, and that's everything. See you guys next time. Peace. The only other things you might want to do is add some custom field for the background color, the text color, and you may want to change the font, play with the styling. And if you do want to add the custom fields, it's super, super easy. You just need to create the field like the color picker, give it a type of color picker, and set the name of it. Then in your CSS, you can just use that anywhere you'd like. So for the background, I'm giving it a linear gradient, and I'm using the BG color that the user sets. All right, see you later.